Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar about the surprising cause of physician burnout and how to fix it. We're excited that you've joined us. We're going to get started here in just a minute as we wait for our attendees to join. I see people popping in. I'll give you another 30 seconds and then we'll continue.
Try to get out the Q&A and all that stuff up here so we can respond to people's questions.
Great, another couple seconds. I see people flooding in.
Nice.
Wonderful. Looks like we've got people from all over. Fantastic.
We should do the chat sometime so they can all tell us where they're from.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It's a great idea. A couple more people are joining. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by introducing our speaker today, James Muir, who is Unislink's SVP of Sales. James is a 30-year veteran in the healthcare industry, having worked for industry-leading companies like Conifer Health and NextGen. He's also a best-selling author and has written several books on adding value to organizations. Maybe he can tell you a little bit about that in his opening. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We really welcome your questions. We have a Q&A chat that will be available throughout this session. If we run out of time, we'll capture all the questions and make sure we follow up directly with you after the webinar with answers. We will also share a link to the webinar. We send over a link to the webinar replay and the deck James is presenting today. So feel free to also share that with your colleagues. Now I'd like to turn it over to James for the presentation. Welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Gina. So today's session is the surprising cause of provider burnout and how to fix it. And this topic has a very special place in my heart because I come from a whole family of caregivers. And I have some brand new data that I'm excited to share with you today that puts a whole new light on this topic. And the provider or the problem of provider burnout, it's a well documented, but we are going to be adding to that a little bit today. And the interesting thing is that when you ask people about what they think the cause of physician burnout is, there's kind of this typical set of answers that you get. And what's surprising is that new data to a large degree kind of turns that on its ear. And because of that new insight, we now have some more effective ways to address that challenge. And so, yes, there is something practical that you can do about it. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So let's jump right in. And Gina already introduced me, but just so you know who you're working with, I am the SVP of Sales at Unislink, where we specialize in revenue cycle management for ambulatory clinics and hospital-based specialties. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the biggest names in healthcare and technology, which you can see there. I'm a 3-time best-selling author. And my mission in life is really just to make complex things simple. And that's what I hope to do for you today. And maybe I should mention here before we get into it, this is a very data-rich presentation. Okay, so don't worry about copying every single stat down. We're going to be sending you a recording of this whole session after we're done, and you'll be able to get the slides as well. So here's what we're going to be covering in today's session. We're going to talk about healthcare burnout and what the reasons are for that burnout. We'll look at some new data that sheds a whole new light on that topic. We're going to look at burnout differences between employed providers versus independent practices. And then we're going to get practical and discuss how to actually go about fixing it. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on cost-cutting strategies as well as strategies for improving revenue. And then I always like to include some practical skills in my workshops, and so this is no exception. So if you hang with me to the end, I promise to teach you an amazing shortcut that you can use to calculate exactly how much additional revenue you could be generating for your practice specifically. It's very cool. You'll be the smartest person in your practice before we're done. That's my promise. So let me start out by doing a poll with you, and maybe Katie, you can help us with this. But I think the poll is: do you know somebody that is suffering from burnout right now in healthcare? And it's pretty simple. It's just kind of a yes or no in this example.
And it doesn't. So far, it's 88% of people that have answered say yes.
And by the way, it doesn't have to be a provider. Everything is fair game here. it could be any role within the practice. We're going to talk about both staff burnout, right, as well as provider burnout, both of those things, because they're actually interrelated, and we'll tie that all together in towards the end.
I
But we'll
think
see that it's not just providers that are affected; everybody's affected.
we're just about at 100% participation.
Awesome. Thank you
So
guys
we're going to go
for.
ahead and end the poll here. And James, it's I don't know if you can see that, but it's 82% yes and 18% no.
Okay, that's kind of what I expected, right? We all know somebody who's burned out, maybe, and maybe even we're burned out. Maybe we should have put that question in there. Um, so what I want to quickly do is let's just define what burnout is. So burnout is a long time stress reaction that it includes a whole ton of symptoms, includes fatigue, exhaustion, trouble concentrating, anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and depression, right? But the most defining trait of burnout is just sort of this sense of emotionlessness and loss of interest in work and personal life, unfortunately, right? And so let's see who is experiencing burnout. And according to the latest data from CDC and from the AMA, 46% of all healthcare workers are reporting experiencing burnout, almost half. And that includes all kinds of healthcare workers, whether it's staff or whether it's providers. Okay. And the bad news is that statistic is actually up 36% from years past, which is a dramatic increase. And what about providers? Well, as it turns out, provider burnout is actually even more pronounced than it is for regular staff. Currently, 62.8% of physicians report suffering from burnout, which is again up 36% since 2020. 56% of nurses report burnout, and 51% of all other clinical staff, that would be like MAs and PAs and NPs, right? They all report burnout. And interestingly, of the providers that report experiencing burnout, 71% of them report experiencing it for more than 1 to 2 years. That is a terrible statistic. And it's probably important to note here on that burnout is, as a phenomenon, it's a lagging indicator, right? Meaning it comes after certain things. What I mean is, there's a number of factors that end up being the root cause of burnout. There's two primarily, but those conditions have to be in place for a long time before it starts manifesting itself as burnout. So in other words, the root causes have been around a whole lot longer than the burnout has been, meaning years, unfortunately. In fact, a very recent poll, I think this was just this month, from Medical Group Management Association reports that 27% of medical groups have had providers quit or retire specifically because of burnout just this year. We're not even done with the year yet, right? Ugh. So who's the most burnout? And what you see here is brand new data from Medscape that shows the percentage of providers that are reporting burnout by specialty, right? So look on there, see if you can find your specialty on there. But emergency medicine is topping the list, and you can see that all of the primary care specialties are also in the top 6 as well. What I found kind of surprising as I looked through this a little bit, even dermatology, like 49% of dermatology providers are reporting burnout, and they've almost always been among the specialties that are like the most satisfied. So I found that kind of surprising. So in the Medscape survey, of the providers that reported that they were experiencing burnout, they asked them, well, how long have you been experiencing that burnout? And this chart is the result of that question. And what you can see, as I mentioned before, is that 71% of those that actually reported experiencing burnout have actually been feeling that way for more than 1 to 2 years. And if you include the last 7 months, that number bumps all the way up to 91%. Yikes, right? That's terrible. So why does it matter? I mean, we all get feeling burnt out from time to time. So who cares? Well, first, this is not just a day of feeling burnout. This is systemic chronic burnout. And on the whole, it's happening, day in and day out. But according to Health and Human Resources, the biggest problem with burnout is that when people feel burned out, they make mistakes. And burned out healthcare workers are 60%, again, this is according to HHS, are 60% more likely to make errors. And I probably don't have to remind you that medical errors are already one of the leading causes of death in the United States. It's very sad, but around 250,000 deaths occur each year that are just attributed to medical errors, to mistakes that we make while we're delivering care. But there's some even broader implications, and that is that the healthcare workers that are experiencing burnout, they're 63% more likely to take a sick day. They're 260% more likely to seek a different job. And by the way, annual turnover due specifically to burnout costs about 15 to 20% of payroll budgets annually, according to HSS.
Hey, James.
Yes.
We have an attendee, a special attendee by the name of Patty Pete, who has raised her hand and wants to add some commentary. So I'm gonna let her in here for a sec.
Yeah, bring her in as a host. We'll be talking about the Patty Pete's method later in this session.
There you go, Patty. You are there.
Well, I usually have much to say, but I'd have to say I accidentally raised my hand because I was trying to answer the poll, and so I think I hit the wrong button. But
Okay.
you guys are in for the biggest treat. I mean, I've looked at some of the material that James has. It's amazing. So great job, guys. But I am sorry, I don't have a question.
That's all right. Stick with us. Stick with us, and we can riff off of the data as you see it.
I'm gonna just mute you, Patty. Stay in here if you want to add, and you can just lower your hand raise.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Okay. Interest, motivation, and energy is reported as being 26% less. These are for people that are experiencing burnout. Focus is decreased by 21%. Overall effort is reduced by 19%. Similarly, overall productivity is reduced by 18%. And people that are experiencing burnout, report more negative thoughts. They report anger. They report a drop in confidence. So I think we can all agree that it is a real and genuine problem. So the big question is this: what causes it? And there is a lot of theories about how and why healthcare workers, especially caregivers, get burned out. So what we want to do is we want to throw this out to you. So Katie, I think we have a poll for this. So Patty, if you don't answer this poll correctly, you may get invited back as a host. So click all of the reasons that you think that, and that'll let us riff off of our group here a little bit on in terms of what our group feels like is the cause of burnout.
This may take a little longer since people have to think through the top reasons here.
Yep, there's quite a few. Now all of these are contributors, by the way. There's not just one thing, but there are a few things that weigh in a little more heavily than other things. So just pick all the ones on that list. By the way, no one's tracking any of this. So we don't know, who you are or what you responded. So it's completely anonymous.
Let's give it we've got about 30% of folks have answered.
They're probably just clicking all the way from top to bottom.
Okay, 30 more seconds.
That was a long list.
I know.
I have to scroll.
I know it is. It is a long list. But it looks like as we come up on our 30 seconds here, long hours is number one. And I'm trying to look at number two here is administrative burden, red tape. Number two. Number three, medical record documentation and coding requirements. And the rest of them are fairly evenly split. But those are, it looks like the top three: long hours, administrative red tape, lack of control, healthcare reform in there, and medical record documentation. So those are the top five.
Okay. Well, like I said, all of these are contributors. There's not just one thing, but there are a couple things that weigh more than the other things. So let's take a look at these. These are what are the most commonly cited reasons that healthcare workers, especially providers, experience burnout. And we've already just gone through it. Long hours seem like the longest one, or the top one. Compensation and insufficient rewards didn't make our poll, but it's commonly cited. Lack of control did make our poll. Administrative burden, I like to call that red tape. Conflicting values. Usually you hear that one in reference to either employers or executive management. The physician might not be in alignment with executive management. Healthcare reform made our poll. medical record documentation and coding requirements made our poll, and these are changing all the time. Just using the medical record or computerizing the whole practice is a common complaint. You know, malpractice and legal stuff kind of makes the list sometimes. Time pressures, unsupportive work environment, and the list goes on there, right? So, and I'm sure if we sat here for a minute as a group, we could probably come up with even more if we tried. They're all contributors. But what we're going to do is we're going to drill down onto some of the more commonly cited ones, because I think you might be surprised by what the details tell us, right? So let's start with time. That was the number one on our list. A total coincidence that happened to be the first one I'm addressing here. But the idea here is that excessive workloads and long hours is the main thing that is causing burnout. And providers, by the way, definitely work long hours. On the whole, 85% of all caregivers work more than the traditional 40 hours per week. And what you can see here from the AMA is that the percentage of providers in each given specialty that work more than 51 hours per week. Okay. So for example, 77% of general surgeons are working more than 51 hours a week, followed by 76% of urologists, 72% of cardiologists, and so on. So find your specialty on there. And then you can see from this chart on the right that if you look at the last two, the two 5%ers, 10% of providers are actually working over 71 hours per week. That is just wild to me. Okay, so I want to plant a seed though here that we're going to come back to and point out a really interesting detail. Do you remember seeing on one of the other charts that 65% of emergency medicine doctors are experiencing burnout? Well, look at the bottom of this list. Only 13% of emergency medicine doctors are working long hours. And so what does that suggest? Well, maybe the thing causing emergency medicine doctors, at least, to feel burned out isn't long hours. Okay, so I'm just planting a seed there. Let's keep moving. Okay, but that little factoid made me ask myself, well, I wonder what a provider's expectation is for their work hours. And interestingly, working long hours starts way before they become caregivers. Medical students on average work an average of 50 hours per week during school. Residents work up to 80 hours per week during residency. And then after residency, physicians continue to work 40 to 60 hours a week. And by the way, these hours include both time spent on direct care as well as administrative stuff. So it's a bit sad, but providers are kind of used to working 50 plus hours a week. But here's the surprising thing. Many providers working greater than 50 hours a week actually report very high job satisfaction. And so we're going to see more on that in just a minute. So I'm not sure we can ascribe burnout completely to working long hours either. Okay, so let's look at sleep real quick. Doctors get an average of 68 hours of sleep per night. The average is 6.5 hours. 93% of providers say they have at least one caffeinated beverage per day. And the most commonly cited reason why they do that is to stay awake. So that is absolutely not enough sleep. But let's be honest here. How many of all of us are actually getting a full 8 hours of sleep that we need every night? Most of us don't. And how many of us are drinking caffeinated beverage, right? Everybody? So despite these averages, again, we've got a significant number of providers that still report high job satisfaction despite what could be considered sleep deprivation. So maybe it's not sleep either. Okay. Now, what about compensation? And that didn't show up in our poll, but it did show up in the main list. And then we're going to see some more data here in a minute on this. But let's just start here with what physicians get paid. And it can vary wildly. How much a provider gets paid, it can vary widely. But again, according to the US Bureau of Labor, physicians and surgeons as a group together average about $239,000 a year. And you can see the averages here in this list by specialty. Again, this is according to the US Bureau of Labor, so they didn't break out the specialties necessarily in the same way I would have done it. But maybe you can find your specialty on there so you can see what the average is for your specialty. And then back to the chart on the right, you can see that the average wages for non-physician providers, NPPs, which is your NPs, your PAs, et cetera, they're earning just under $100,000 a year. And then just below that, you can see what the median wage is for all occupations in the United States. Again, this is all back reported in 2023. Now, this is just for reference right now. We're going to come back to this here in just a second. Okay, so we could dig in more, but for time's sake, what I want to do is I want to simplify this and categorize the reasons, because we're going to get real practical about this. So here are all the reasons that we saw before, including many that we saw on our poll. And as it turns out, we can simplify these down into just 6 categories. Let's see if we can get those up here for you. Time, compensation, administrative burden, legal, experience, and control. Okay, those things. So again, hold that thought. We're going to come back to these categories here in just a second. Okay, before we do that, I'm going to introduce you to some new data. And this data comes from Medscape and is reported in their report called U.S. Physician Burnout and Depression Report. And it's a 2024 data. It's a great sampling. It includes over 10,000 U.S. physicians across 29 different specialties. And the respondents were required to complete a 10 to 15 minute online survey. And this is for physicians. So that's a fairly big commitment, if you ask me, on their part to get them to take 15 minutes and fill out a survey. And given the response, we've got only a 1% possibility of a sampling error and a 95% confidence level in the data. So it's good data. And here are the most important results that from that report that help us today in our topic for burnout. The report's much longer than this. But this is what we're going to use today. And so what Medscape did is if a physician reported suffering from burnout, then they asked them, what specifically would help you most with your burnout? And the answers in this list start to tell us a very interesting story about what might really be causing the root cause of physician burnout. And you can see here that at the very top of the list, the number one response is increased compensation. Okay. The second highest response was adding support staff, which, by the way, wasn't even listed in the other list, by the way, right? This is the first time we see that in any of the data that I have looked at. Third, we have more manageable work schedule, which, to be candid, is not all that unexpected, followed by increased control and autonomy, which is interesting, and we're going to dig down on that in a bit, but it turns out that autonomy and control turn out to be a very big factor for providers. Fifth, we've got lighter patient load, which is similar to work schedule, but at this stage, we're kind of starting to see the popularity of the responses start to drop quite a bit here. Fewer government regulations is next, followed by get a new job. Yikes. And then I'm sure you'll chuckle when you see this one like I did, not having to see certain patients. It's just that one patient, right? But you can see that the responses at this stage are dropping way down here now. And then we see better access to personal time. And then we kind of see this, which is kind of the same as work schedule. And then everything else gets lumped into this thing called other. Now, I don't have to tell you that this is very valuable information because it gives us suggests to us some of the most effective interventions that we can employ to address physician burnout as provided by the providers themselves. Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to simplify this even further by using the categories that we just developed a second ago. Okay, and so here we see the top 8 suggestions from the Medscape survey ranked from top to bottom, along with the categories that we had discovered earlier. So once again, we see that all 6 categories are represented. So that makes us feel real confident in the categories that we developed. And so now I want to take a moment and draw some insights from all this. Okay, first, compensation matters. It turned up in our initial research, and it's the number one thing that physicians say make a difference. Second, administrative burdens are a big factor, and that turned up in our survey too, that we just did, our poll. Okay. In fact, much more, in fact, than we would have originally expected, because it actually ended up showing up in 3 different ways in the physician responses by adding support staff, patient loads, and government regulations, right? I would also throw legal into this category as well. Third, control and autonomy matters. Okay. It's the 4th biggest intervention suggested by physicians. 41% say it helps, and we're going to see even more evidence here of that in just a second. And then 4th, physicians having control over their work schedules is a big satisfier or dissatisfier for providers, right? And while we placed that in the time category here, it's also kind of a control thing too, that we talked about, having control over or some flexibility over your work schedule. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to try to sum up all the insights we've reviewed to this point. Burnout is a combination of compensation, control, time and workload issues, job experience, and administrative burdens. And I'm going to share some additional information on this here in just a second. But just to cut to the chase here, the two biggest factors are compensation and control, those two things. And let me share one more insight that you already know, and that is that providers are literally the engine of healthcare. They're the mitochondria of the entire system. They literally make everything else runs. And without them, nothing runs. And I'm going to give you some solid proof on this statement here in just a second. But the truth is, when physicians benefit, when providers benefit, we all benefit. Okay. And by that, I mean patients, our staff, finance, and society as a whole. Okay. And so I'm really excited to share with you some insights on this in just a second. But the short version is that we need to take care of them, really, in the same way that they're taking care of us. Okay. So let's shift gears here a little bit to an important aspect of provider burnout and job satisfaction, and that is employment. And when I first started pulling this data together, a new statistic that I discovered a new statistic that just about knocked me out of my chair. It used to be when we would talk about physicians being employed, what we really meant was hospitals, right? So there was like being employed meant being employed by a hospital, and everybody else was an independent practice. But there is a whole new category now that didn't exist before that we have to pay attention to now, and that is private equity, okay, or corporations. That is that private equity companies or corporations are acquiring physician clinics. And so what happens now is we've really got three categories that we need to pay attention to. We've got hospital ownership, we've got corporate ownership, and then we have independent practice. And what you see here is a chart showing the trend of physician ownership in these three categories since 2019. And what you can see here is that hospital ownership, which is that line in the blue, has risen steadily to where today 55.1% of all physicians in the United States are now employed by hospitals. Below that, you see in the black line, you can see that independent practice ownership has declined dramatically since 2019, where today only 22.4% of physicians are now considered in independent practice. Okay, and then we got this new orange line sneaking up from the bottom here, and that is the ownership of corporations and private equity. Okay, and that has risen steadily to where 22.5% of all physicians are now employed by corporations. So it actually has overtaken independent practice. Okay, now you're probably experiencing the same surprise reaction that I did when I first learned this, right? But what it means is that as of today, 77.6% of all physicians are employed in one way or another. Okay, and that trend is expected to continue. And by the way, for the record, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with physicians being employed. But what I am going to show you on the next slide is that it is definitely contributing to physician dissatisfaction and burnout. So this is a shocking piece of information that I turned up during my research for this webinar. Okay, so if that last slide wasn't shocking enough, here's a bombshell that will likely get your attention. At least it got my attention. It might surprise you to discover that on average, self-employed physicians actually earn on average 20% more than employed physicians. And 63% of self-employed physicians report job satisfaction compared to only 53% of employed physicians. So on average, they're happier. 91% of self-employed physicians report a feeling of a high degree of control, which we saw earlier is a major factor, compared to 68% of employed physicians. And similarly, 87% of employed physicians feel like they have autonomy, that's a key word there, to make important decisions compared to just 55% of employed docs. So what's happening is we're starting to get a picture here of the differences between provider experience in an independent practice versus employed docs. And maybe a contributor to why provider burnout is actually rising. All right, so let's pull this new insight into our 6 categories. Okay, and what you see here is our 6 categories: compensation, control, administrative burden, experience, time, and legal, compared between self-employed providers and employed providers. And where you see a green check mark, it means there's a clear winner in that category. Where there's a yellow indicator, it means there's a top up, there's no clear winner. And so you can see on the compensation, we know that independent practices are on average about 20% more than employed docs. On the control spectrum, we know that self-employed providers actually feel more control. That's what they report in surveys. And then on administrative burden, there is no clear winner. It's a toss-up between the two. And I haven't shared that data with you yet, but self-employed providers are also report better overall experience than employed docs do. And self-employed providers also report greater overall happiness and control over their schedules, which makes sense. They're the equity holders in the practice, so they probably have more control over their schedules. And for employed providers, being employed is clearly a win for them over self-employment when it comes to legal issues. And maybe just to add a little color to that, as an example, I think 88% of employed providers actually don't cover their own malpractice premiums, right? The employer does that. And generally other legal issues are basically handled the same way. So it's definitely a clear win on that front for being employed. But we're starting to see a comparison here with these 2 different ways. And so we're starting to get a picture around compensation and control. And somebody asked me for this slide. So here's a quick summary of some of the benefits of being an independent practice. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean that there aren't happy employed doctors. That's not true at all. There are. It's just that on average, the independent practices do a little bit better than the employed providers. Okay, so here's a summary insight for you. In order to address burnout, we need to make it possible to succeed in independent practice, or we need to address the shortcomings that come with provider employment because they don't win in all the different categories. Okay, all right. And I would love to spend more time on data, but those who come to my workshops know that I love to make each session practical and actionable. And so that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to talk about what we can actually do to address provider and staff burnout. All right, so big question. How do we fix it? How do we fix it? And we're going to want to create strategies for each of our 6 categories. Okay, and we're going to want to start from the top down because this is the priority that the providers have told us is the most important. And since we have limited time today, what we're going to do with our time left is we're going to get really serious about compensation. And in order to do that, we're going to look at all these different factors that affect compensation. And what you can see right here are 6 factors that affect all different specialties in terms of compensation. These include rising costs, declining reimbursement, inflation, geographic location and market factors, practice setting, and productivity. And for time's sake today, we're just going to touch on the first 3 of these. And so let's talk about rising costs for a minute. And I'm sure none of you are surprised that costs are rising. But in a recent MGMA survey, I think this is just back in June, 92% of medical groups reported that their costs are higher this year than they were last year. So no big shock there. Let's take a minute and look at where the costs typically are in a medical practice. And by the way, practice costs can vary quite a bit based on specialty. And so what you see here is a breakdown of the average cost distribution for medical practices according to Profit Sense and MGMA. And given that healthcare is a very human resource intensive business, I'm sure it's not going to come as a surprise that employee wages and benefits are the #1 expense for ambulatory medical practices. These percentages look quite a bit different for hospital-based specialty than this. But anyway, this will give us a reference point. We're going to come back to this here in just a second. And then this is some MGMA data for staffing costs for primary care. So not every specialty, but for primary care as a percentage of overall revenue. And so you've got 5 different categories here. I'll just let you know, I'm not going to go through those in detail, but they do change quite a bit based on specialty. But for primary care, about 1/3 of all revenue is consumed by our staffing. Okay, so let's look at reimbursement for a second. And you might want to grab your antacid here, because here is what the data shows. Most of this, by the way, is focused on Medicare, since many payer contracts are based on Medicare. The implications of what's on this slide are actually pretty far-reaching. And I'm sure many of you remember that we got a 2% pay cut from Medicare in 2023. And then this year, we got another 3.37 cut to the conversion factor. In fact, just in the period from 2020 to 2023, the Medicare conversion factor decreased by 6%. And so it goes without saying that the CMS fee schedule is not keeping up with inflation. Okay, I mean, if we at least got some small increases, it might have kept us on par with inflation, but we haven't even gotten that. In fact, if you go back all the way to 2001 and then account for inflation, Medicare payment has effectively decreased by a shocking 26%. And this is just completely unsustainable. So something needs to be done about that. And what makes this worse is that so many of our commercial payer contracts actually reference Medicare in their language. And what that means is as Medicare drops, this leads to similarly declining commercial payments at the same time. And then just to top it all off, Medicare utilization, meaning how often patients come in to see us, is up 45% since 2005. So we see more Medicare visits, but we end up getting paid less for each one. Okay, so what about next year? Well, as of this session, right, recording right now, CMS is estimating that the 2025 PFS conversion factor is going to be $32.36, which is another 2.8% reduction. Okay, and supposedly the reason for all of this is because the program itself is supposed to be budgetarily neutral. So I'm just going to throw it out there. I urge you to make your voices known to your local representatives, because this is completely unsustainable for us. So what are the implications of all this? Well, first, it's putting a huge amount of financial pressure on our providers and really everyone in the professional services space. Second, it's going to limit, ultimately, it's going to limit access to care, because providers are going to start throttling the care that they offer to Medicare patients. In fact, we're already seeing some of that. Some providers might even choose to just stop participating in Medicare altogether. I'm working with a group right now that offers a lot of elective services in a really strong commercial market. And so they're just deciding not to participate with Medicare in 2025. Okay. And so that's sad and an important social problem that we have. Okay, but the biggest implication for today's session anyway is that it contributes greatly to provider dissatisfaction and burnout, because it reduces their compensation. And I probably should have said it on this. I probably should have a separate slide on this, but here's the thing that we've already covered enough to say is providers don't mind working long hours, and they don't like red tape, but they'll deal with it so long as they're getting compensated for it. Okay, it's when they have to work long hours and deal with massive red tape and not get paid for it, that's when they start feeling burnt out. All right, unfortunately, it doesn't end there either. So not only is compensation not keeping up with inflation, it turns out that medical inflation is actually 3% worse for us. Okay, when you see the consumer price index, it's actually a combination of all these different factors that are reported as a single number. And medical care is one of those numbers, right? One of those factors that's in there. But when you break out medical inflation on its own, it is always, for the last 15 years, it is always about 3% higher every year than the normal inflation rate. And so what you're getting is this split, right? It's actually diverging, right? Where medical inflation is actually growing at a faster rate than normal inflation is. Anyway, so you can see the gap just keeps on widening here. So let's keep going here. So what are the implications of this from a compensation perspective? Well, because payers set rates prospectively, it can often take years for renegotiated contracts to fully reflect the inflation costs. Okay, in fact, Patty, and I were actually working with a group on Friday that specializes in renegotiating contracts in the ambulatory space. Okay, and so during our time with them, I selfishly asked them, well, how often do you recommend that practices renegotiate your contracts? And you know what they said? Every year. every year. They said without some very special provisions in the contract, and they said sometimes even if there is special provisions, clinics will always get paid less than they should. They said multi-year contracts just further delay the adjustment of rates to match inflation. And that's just because with multi-year contracts, the providers aren't able to quickly change the rate. So insurers that insurers end up using the lower rates to reimburse services. Okay, and of course, inflation drives up labor costs, which we've all seen. And according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, medical costs are actually expected to, like next year, they're thinking that medical costs are going to rise even more than the normal 3%. They estimate that it's going to go up to on the order of 7.5% to 8% in 2025. So before I throw you all into a fit of depression here, what I want to do is get practical and talk about how we can fix all this stuff. Right now, aren't you glad we only covered 3 items here? Because you're probably getting depressed at this point. Okay,
hey, James,
so
let me just interrupt for a quick second. We're almost at about 45 minutes in, so 15 minutes left. So just giving the time check.
Okay, I'm going to hustle. So we'll get through all of this. I got some cool stuff to show you. So let's just do a quick refresher. The 2 top factors are compensation and control. And for independent practices, and largely for corporate employed providers, there's really just 2 levers that you can use to improve provider compensation. We can either increase revenue or we can reduce costs. That's all there is. That's it. Okay, so let's start with costs. And so I don't know if you guys have already tried this, but just maybe answer in your head, have you already tried to work on cost cutting in your practice? My guess is that the answer is yes, you have, right? And so when you look at the top initiatives for cost cutting, this is the list that you end up with, okay? And you can see the sources down at the bottom on this one. But what you're seeing here is the top cost cutting initiatives according to those references. And to the right of those, you're going to see a range, which is what's the impact that you could use if you were to cut costs there, if you're successful in cutting costs in that area. And to the right of that, you can see a range of how long it takes on average to realize the savings in that area once you start the cost cutting initiative. So for example, on the top, we see standardizing on supplies and equipment, which has a potential savings of 5 to 10% on supplies. It takes 1 to 4 months to realize that savings if you haven't already done it. Or by reducing energy consumption, for example, you can save 10 to 15% on energy, and that can be realized in weeks, unless, of course, you do something like solar to add to your billing. That will take a little bit longer. But those are, you can look through those different initiatives there. I won't go through each one of them. An interesting one is that one that says optimizing, it's the second at the bottom, optimizing staffing. And what makes it kind of interesting is that the potential impact has a negative number in the range. So why would that be? Well, if we're understaffed, then adding the appropriate staff means adding staff, and that's going to raise costs, not lower them. Now, optimizing staffing should manifest itself in greater revenue, which ideally will more than offset the cost, but it is true that optimizing staff improves efficiency, and improving efficiency lowers costs. So that may sound a little counterintuitive, so I'm going to drill down on that just a little bit, but what you see here is a model that, depicting all the complexities that are associated with staffing. But the overall principle is this: overstaffing, understaffing, and inappropriate staff all increase costs and decrease margin. Okay, so for example, insufficient staff causes us to use existing staff more. That often leads to increased overtime, which leads to increased costs and increased turnover, and both of those lead to decreased margins. Increased turnover itself is a problem. Because it often causes us to use insufficiently trained staff to do work. And that often leads to increased errors, which leads to increased rework and lower job satisfaction, which respectively lead to lower margins and, ironically, even more turnover. And then moving back up the chain a couple of steps, or you can look at the third chain, we see that increased errors also leads to reduced reimbursement, which again lowers margins. And then finally, inadequate or inappropriate staff leads to reduced efficiency, and reduced efficiency leads to increased costs, and again, lower margins. So to put it short, we don't want too many staff, and we don't want inadequate staff, and we don't want staff that are not trained for the job. All 3 of those things are going to increase your costs and decrease your margins. So you kind of got the Goldilocks principle here, where you want not too much and not too little. We want it just right. So it's worth mentioning here that the MGMA data shows that the most profitable groups actually have a higher than average staff, not lower. And it's also worth mentioning here that the problem of inappropriate staff or not sufficiently trained can often be just handled with training. Okay, and then finally, I'll just share that staff turnover is extremely costly. It's not only because of the time and expense of finding new staff, but it's also because of the opportunity cost and the quality of work that suffers while we're understaffed. And because of that, it's estimated that the cost of turnover is approximately 50% of that role, whatever role you're talking about, their annual salary. Okay, let's keep cooking here. I wanted to know what the top cost-cutting initiatives were from year to year, and to see if there are any trends. And guess what? Initiatives for cost cutting just don't change that much from year to year. Historically, they tend to be the same things year after year after year. So let me just ask you a question. If we're literally focusing on the same exact cost cutting initiatives year after year after year, how much more are we going to get out of these same areas? There really isn't just, there probably isn't a lot of juice there left if we've already done these initiatives at some point. And so that gave me a chance to introduce one of my favorite Peter Drucker isms, and that is that the key to successful improvement is to prioritize the areas where you can make the biggest difference, right? Or sometimes we hear this concept as the phrase, I'm sure you've all heard it, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so what we're looking for, our practice, cost distribution here again, and we see that business supplies, for example, are taking up 4% of our costs. I mean, are we really going to make a big difference for the practice, and by extension, our providers, right? By cutting 5 to 10% more of the 4%, especially if that's already been an initiative year after year after year, it's just not enough. We're never going to significantly move the dial if we keep focusing on minor costs. And I'm not saying ignore costs. I'm just suggesting that if we follow Peter Drucker's advice and prioritizing the places where we can make the biggest difference, then in this example, that means we're going to have to look at things like staffing and facility, because that's where the most of the costs are. Okay, so here's an insight that's not going to surprise you, but a lot of the expenses in a medical practices are difficult or impossible to control. Most of them are affected by the economy and our local market. For example, Patty and I are working with a large group in Boston. So I ended up looking up what the going salary would be for revenue cycle specialists in the Boston market. And you can imagine my surprise when I saw that the average was $142,000 a year. That's the average. The high you can see there is over $206,000, and the lowest is about 100 grand. Okay, so you're probably all making plans to move to Boston right now, right? But the point of all this is that we don't have a lot of control over things like utility costs, malpractice, leasing, and labor, because the economy and market forces end up driving those things. So I want to drop an insight on you here, and that is that practices have far more control over the strategies for increasing revenue than they do in cutting costs. Far more control. I'm going to show you why that is in a minute. Now, I'm not saying don't try to cut costs. We should cut costs, but I'm saying that for time in to results out, you're going to get more mileage out of working on increasing your revenue than you will on cutting your costs. So that's a big one. So let's talk about increasing revenue. There's basically just 3 strategies for increasing revenue. Okay, we can increase production, we can increase effectiveness and efficiency, and we can create new revenue streams. Those 3 strategies. So an easier way to remember that is you can do more, you can do better, or you can do new. That's it. Do more, do better, or do new. Okay, and here you can see a summary of the strategies that we can use to increase production, the do more strategy on the left, alongside some of the strategies that we can use to create new revenue streams, do new, on the right. And increasing production tends to be about seeing more patients, while new revenue streams tends to be about adding things like ancillary services like lab or x-ray, or maybe doing new procedures. Okay, we could do a whole webinar on both of these 2 strategies, but you'll get the deck, and so we don't have to go over them right now, but let's compare the dynamics of all 3 of these strategies briefly. So here's our 3 strategies: do more, do better, and do new, compared, showing some of the dynamics for each one. And something that works across the board, by the way, is to just reevaluate your fee schedule and your contracts with payers. Okay, that is, we can charge more for the same work we're doing now, or get reimbursed more anyway. Otherwise, we're going to need to see more patients to increase production, right? Do more. And the strategy we use to see more patients is going to depend on whether you're fully utilized or not. If you're close to full utilization, then the only way to see more patients is to extend your hours, add providers, or add additional clinics. If you're at partial utilization, then you can do things like eliminating no-shows, optimize your scheduling, you can recall patients, you can encourage referrals, right? You can encourage marketing and those kinds of things. The second strategy to increase effectiveness and efficiency, which is do better, we're going to need to capture a higher percentage of our potential revenue. That's basically the strategy. Okay. And that means we're going to need to review and upgrade our operational processes. Okay. And I'm going to provide more details on that in the next slide. And then when it comes to creating new revenue streams, the do new, there's a common list of things that offering new services tends to require. Typically, we have to create new operations and new processes. We might need additional staff or staff training. They often require upfront investments, like when creating a lab, or it might require new equipment and supplies, like when offering X-ray. It might require facility modifications. It might come with a whole bunch of regulatory and compliance and insurance issues that we have to deal with. We might need, we'll probably need marketing promotion to promote our new procedure. And very often there's some kind of technology integration. So all three of these, by the way, are great strategies, but you'll notice that doing more and doing new both come with a ton of baggage. Okay. And so I want to offer you an insight on increasing efficiency and effectiveness, right? The do better strategy that I think you're going to like. Doing better doesn't require that you see any more patients. Doing better doesn't require that we get any new lines of get into any new lines of business, and it doesn't require any large capital outlays. Okay, all it requires is that we do a better job of the workload that we already have right now. Okay, and Elizabeth Woodcock says this perfectly, so I'm just going to quote her. She says, "Maximizing revenue in medical practices isn't about seeing more patients. It's about getting paid for the work that you already do. Efficiency in the revenue cycle is the key to unlocking hidden profits." So perfectly said there. Here's a much more detailed list about why increasing effectiveness and efficiency, the do better strategy, is probably the first place that you want to start running. We're running short on time, so you'll get this in the deck. And so how do we go about doing better? Okay, and what you see here is 15 critical processes within your practice that affect revenue and provider compensation. Okay, and we could do a whole webinar on just these 15 processes. In fact, we could probably do several webinars on this. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but virtually all of these fall into the category of revenue cycle management, simply because that's how practices generate revenue in U.S. healthcare. Okay, but there's a shortcut that I'm going to teach you here before we're done. So hang in there with me. Okay, now this might be the coolest insight that I have to share with you today, so I hope you enjoy this. But because it's going to reconnect staff burnout with provider burnout that we started with. Okay, as it turns out, there is a strong correlation between provider compensation and staff compensation in independent practices. Okay, and when I say strong, I mean there is a 94% correlation between provider compensation and staff compensation in independent practices. That means that when providers get compensated more, the staff get compensated more. And by the way, that's not true for every industry. Providers are uncommonly generous when it comes to compensating staff. Well-compensated providers have better compensated staff. Now that's kind of encouraging, isn't it? Right? And what that means is that when we help solve provider burnout, we also end up helping address the staff burnout as well. Okay, and that's a key insight, right? Because it's a virtuous cycle. When we solve the provider burnout problem, we also help address the staff burnout. And I didn't show you the data, but as you might guess, compensation is also super important to staff. All right, so for time's sake, I'm going to shift gears right now so that you can learn a very cool skill that you can walk out of here with. And we've already reviewed the kinds of things that you can do to improve revenue and provider compensation. But what I want to do now is teach you how to answer the question, how much you might be able to improve your practice revenue and provider compensation by doing better. Okay, so how much improvement is possible? Well, the answer to that question is unique for every single practice. Okay, some might be able to improve a little, some might be able to improve a lot. And as it turns out, there is a way to calculate that using your practice's KPIs, your key performance indicators. And you basically only need one KPI in this example. And the shortcut that I'm going to show you, I learned from Patty Peets, who actually jumped in here briefly. And so I appropriately call it the Patty Peets method. Okay, and the key performance indicator that we're going to use to figure out your individual practice's improvement potential is your net collection rate, or your NCR. Okay, and your net collection rate is the percentage of reimbursement that you actually got out of the reimbursement allowed by your contracts with payers. Okay, or said another way, your net collection rate answers this question: what percentage of your total collectible dollar did you actually collect? Okay, did you collect everything you could have? What is that percentage? And the formula for the NCR is right here. It's total payments divided by charges minus contractual adjustments. Okay, now the formula is easy, but there is a little bit of nuance to getting this number right. So I want to review a couple items with you. First, the payments part includes all payments. Okay, that means including patient payments, because that's a controllable part of your charge. So you need to include it. Second, when subtracting the adjustments, only use contractual adjustments. Do not use all adjustments. Okay, don't include bad debt, for example. Okay, using all adjustments will skew your net collections rate upward and fool you into thinking that you're doing better than you actually are. Okay, and by the way, there is a KPI that uses all adjustments. It's called the revenue realization rate, and it is useful, but that's not what this is. We're calculating net collection rate here. Okay, next, when you run your report, run it for 90 days in arrears, so there's been enough time for claim adjudication to have taken place. Okay, so if I was going to run this report today, I'd run it for like June of 2023 to May of 2024, since it's possible that all the claims from maybe June, July, and August haven't been fully adjudicated yet. Okay, next, I recommend you run a separate adjustment report for that exact same period, because that will allow you to much more easily determine which of those adjustments are contractual and which ones aren't. And then finally, just know that significant credit balances, that if you're carrying significant credit balances on your books, that can artificially skew your net collection rate upward and fool you into thinking you're doing much better than you are. A few credit balances is okay. It's not going to hurt you, but if you have a lot, then you're going to need to back some of those out, usually based on age. Okay, that's the only tricky stuff. Okay, the rest is easy. Okay, so here's an example of calculating our net collection rate. We got our total billed charge at 10 million. We got our total contractual adjustments at 3 million, and our total payments is at 6 million. I like these nice round numbers. First, because of the parentheses that you see there, we want to subtract our contractual adjustments from our charges. Okay, that's 10 million minus 3 million, which equals 7 million. Super easy. Okay, now we're going to divide our total payments by that number. So in this case, that's $6 million divided by 7 million, which comes to 85.71%. So our net collection rate in this example is 85.71%. Super easy, right? All right, so what is a good net collection rate? Well, according to MGMA and HFMA, the average net collection rate for ambulatory practices is between 95 and 98%. My personal experience is that the average is probably closer to 95, and we often see net collection rates below that. Okay, that means, though, that any net collection rate that's below 98% means that there's some room for improvement, which is good. That means we can get some additional revenue out of the existing work that we're doing. And so the next question is, how much would that be in dollars? And that's what we're going to figure out next. Okay, so this is a cool skill here. Here are the steps to calculate the actual value of improving your net collection rate using the Patty Peets method. Okay, so first, you're going to calculate your net collection rate, which we just did. Then second, you're going to use the same data that you use to calculate your net collection rate. And then you're going to divide your total payments by your net collection rate. Okay, that's going to give you the value of a 100% net collection rate. Okay, third step is using your 100% net collection, your net collection rate value. Okay, you're going to multiply that number by 95, 96, 97, and 98%. That's going to give you the total value of your receivables at each rate. Okay, and then in step 4, we're just going to calculate the value of the difference for each rate, and you're going to do that by subtracting your original payments from each of the new higher net collection rate totals. Okay, that calculates the value of improving your net collection rate. So here's an example. Okay, and this is a real example, by the way. We run a report, for maybe June to May, and then that tells us that we have, about 19 million in total charges, 6.5 million in total payments, and almost 10 million in contractual adjustments. Okay, that makes our net collection rate 71.76 in this example. The value of our receivables at 100% net collection rate would be 9.288990. Okay, and now we're just going to multiply that by 95, 96, 97, and 98% to calculate what the payments would look like at those net collection rates. Okay, that's the second column on the bottom, by the way. And then we're just going to subtract our original actual payments. That's the third column down there on that table on the bottom, and they're all the same number. And then the value of the difference is just calculated by subtracting one from the other. And that's what we see in the far right column for each value. And you can see here that in this example, which is a real example, by the way, that the monetized value of improving our net collections rate is between 2.1 and $2.4 million. That's basically a 30% improvement in revenue. And that's surprising, isn't it? Right. And the most important thing is that that revenue can be realized using the exact same services and the exact same volume that we're doing right now. We don't have to see more patients, and we don't have to add any more new services. Okay, so that's the moral of the story. The do better strategy can make a big difference without having to increase any volume. And so now you have the ability to calculate your own upside to doing better. So I would just say, give it a try. I promise you'll be surprised. And then if you're an overachiever, and I know that's all of you, right? Here's your homework assignment. Now that you know what the value of the upside is to the practice, go plug those numbers into your provider compensation model. It's really not hard because you're not going to be changing their productivity at all. You're just going to be applying a higher revenue number to the provider's existing model. And that's going to allow you to create sort of a simple one-line statement that would say a 96% net collection rate will improve Dr. Jones's compensation from this number to this number, just like I did on the previous example, okay, for the whole practice. So here's an interesting insight for you. Improving practice revenue improves provider revenue. Okay. Now, we've really only covered one KPI here, and that was the net collection rate. But if you want to know more, and other KPIs that will help you in amazing ways, like the one you just saw, you can download this white paper that I'm showing you right here. It's called 7 Performance Benchmarks That Every Practice Should Know. You can click on or use that QR code, or you can click on the URL that's right there, and it's there. It's completely free, right? All right. If you're really ambitious, then you can go one step further, and you can do a full revenue cycle analysis. Okay. And not only will that tell you how much upside there is in the improvement, but it will actually tell you where to go in your business to get it. Okay. And you already learned the first step here. That's the dark blue one at the top, by calculating the financial upside. So we know how much revenue. The next step is just to validate, this is the lighter blue one just below it, the second one, to identify where those returns might come from by running several more reports. Okay. And then step 3 is a staffing analysis, and then you can calculate a full return and improvement plan. And it's a lot of work, but we do them every day here at UnisLink. And I've arranged for everybody that's on this session to be able to get a full revenue cycle assessment at no charge with no obligation. So if that's interesting to you, just use the QR code or use the URL that you see down at the bottom. I promise you the insights are amazing. Okay, so let's wrap up. Here is a summary of the ridiculous number of insights that I covered during this session. I promised you it would be data rich. Hopefully I didn't disappoint. And to that, I just want to restate 3 of the insights that together kind of summarize what this session is all about. And that's, first, improving provider revenue addresses the top cause of provider burnout. Second, improving practice revenue helps improve provider revenue. And third, improving provider revenue improves staff revenue. Okay, now somebody asked for the QR codes again, so here they are. I'm going to leave them on the screen here for a second so you can take a picture of them if you want. But let me just conclude by leaving you with one final thought here. We've done a whole lot of talking about the healthcare industry and about improving provider revenue. And as I mentioned before, I come from a family of caregivers, so I have a very special place in my heart for physicians, NPs, PAs, MAs, all caregivers. And this is my personal belief, so you just take it for what it's worth. We really need to fight to preserve the practice of independent medicine. Okay, I genuinely think that we are at risk of losing it. And what I can share personally is just that the happiest providers I know, the happiest staff I know, they all come from successful independent practices. And one of the biggest barriers to that is just that payers have made billing so challenging that it's almost impossible to keep up with. And because of that, less and less people are choosing medicine as a field to go into. And that's sad to me, because I know firsthand the joy that comes from helping other people with their health. So I know that a lot of us, probably most of us on this session, caring directly for patients is really not our calling, right? That's not, like, I can't help patients directly. I don't know how to do that. But what I can do, and what we all can do, is we can enable those who do. And we can lift others' burdens, those who care for others, so that they can serve more people and they can serve them better and happier. And so in the end, to me, it's really not about practice revenue or provider compensation. It's really about caring for patients. And so with that, we'll wrap up. Gina, I know I'm a little bit over here, so I don't know what we can do with the questions, but if there are some questions, I'm happy to take a shot at it.
Thank you, James. Yeah, we are running a little bit late, but we appreciate you haven't lost a single person. That's how great that information was. So thank you for that. There are some questions. So what we will do is we recorded them and we will follow up directly with anybody that has asked them when we send the recording and the other assets that we talked about today.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. I hope you guys all found it valuable, and I hope it makes a huge difference for you in your practice.
Thank you, James. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.